Hello everyone and welcome to the Great Guild Wars 2 Countdown. I had a lot of people suggest we just combine this with daily, so we're going to go ahead with the Great Guild Wars 2 Countdown. 57 days remaining, but all the content's pretty much just going to be Guild Wars 2 daily. Today we are going to be looking at servers, also something that was news to me for lore, but actually probably isn't going to be news to a lot of people because I missed it for the longest period of time. Anyway, the footage in the background comes from me. It's going to be the server areas in Guild Wars 1, which should be very fun and very cool. And in addition to that, also, we're going to be seeing the Pale Tree in Guild Wars 1. And that's because this newsy type topic that I wanted to bring up was that recently there was a tower talk with Ree Sosby. I believe it was the second one. I remember listening to the first one a long time ago. Essentially, it's an audio interview podcast where they got together with one of the world builders, Ree Sosby. Pretty much there's two main guys, right? You've got Ree Sosby and Jeff Grubb, and these two are responsible for writing all the big lore kind of thing. There's obviously a lot of writers in the game that work on the game, but these two are kind of the world crafters and they decide on all the massive things. And Ree Sosby came onto this Tower Talk, this audio interview, to talk about the Sylvari with those guys. The Sylvari, to me, are not a race I'm a massive fan of, I've got to be honest, but they do have some incredible lore, and there was some new stuff that came out of this interview with Ree. A lot of it was kind of rehashing stuff that we already knew, so if you feel like you don't know too much about the Sylvari right now, it could be good for you there. But also, deeper in, we begin to hear some other things about the Pale Tree itself that we'd never heard before now. The idea is, Ree essentially goes forward to explain, and I'll let you listen to it yourself if you want to. There'll be a link in the description below. Ree essentially explains that the Pale Tree, as we already knew, could communicate with Sylvari in some way. We already knew this. This was already established. But it's kind of been expanded upon now that there's actually a place at the base of the Pale Tree or within the Pale Tree that we, the players, can actually go into. And within the Pale Tree here, you can actually find the spirit of the Pale Tree and interact with it. There's like a physical embodiment of the Pale Tree, and it's this spirit that looks very much like a Sylvari. It's been personified far more than we ever really understood before now, which is just very, very interesting. So at first we just thought it was this tree that had some means of communicating with Sylvari, but now we see that it actually is this literal spirit that's going around and is now very busy. We had the hint or understanding before that as more Sylvari were born into the world, the Pale Tree had less time to focus on individual Sylvari, and at first I think a lot of us just took that as, right, well, it's more silence to everyone in general, but there is some kind of communication there, a very subtle one. But now we can actually see it literally is, as Ree seems to explain, that it's this spirit that is kind of existing there and is very busy and kind of running around and has got a lot to do, and that's why it can't always communicate with all Sylvari, which is very, very cool. I came up with a little bit of a theory on this, which is completely speculation, I'll say that straight away. But now that we know that the Pale Tree is essentially a tree that has a spirit, or it's a spirit inhabiting a tree, or a spirit that's guiding a tree and guiding nature, if you look back at some of the original Guild Wars 1 lore, that we've already seen that there were links, possible links there and hints, and maybe something was going on. If you look back now, it seems even more likely. In Guild Wars 1, in the Maguma jungle, it was established that there were a group of Critons that many years before Guild Wars 1 began, left Kryta and went into the Maguma jungle to try and live there, and eventually these people became known as the Druids, and they spent so long in the Maguma jungle that eventually, I believe the description is that they transcended their mortal bodies to become one with nature. And in Guild Wars 1, you could go through and find the spirits of these druids. They were literally spirits that had become one with nature that now lived in the Maguma jungle. There were also ruins of these Critons littered about in the jungle. You could find like all their old buildings and architecture that was still out there in the forest, and the things that they built from themselves and that they lived in were very green, very natural huts and shelters that seemed to have been grown out of the forest itself. And what do you know, in Guild Wars 2, if you have a look at the right screenshots or videos, you can see that around there the Sylvari seem to be living in huts and houses very, very similar to what the Druids were living in. So we had these hints before, and now that we've got this exact thing that where Ree's saying that pretty much the Pale Tree has this actual physical spirit that's in there, I think very much that this spirit could be a Druid, and maybe this is how the Pale Tree came into being. It was a Druid that had long before transcended its mortal body and become one with nature, and now somehow inhabited this seed and grew into the Pale Tree. And this is a Druid we're looking at. This is a human, essentially, from a very long time ago that became one with nature and now has grown grown into this tree and produced this entirely new race. And this also sheds forward more light on why the Sylvari look the way they do. ArenaNet have never given a specific answer as to why Sylvari seem to be mimicking humans so heavily. The most they've said is that the people in the universe have theories. They say that some characters in the universe theorize that it's because the Pale Tree was born on the graves of humans, so it was mimicking through that. And other people theorize that it's because humans had a great impact on the tree during its development and life, because that was a settlement where lots of humans lived with Ventari. And this could be why the Sylvari were mimicking humans, but they never gave a solid answer. And now we've got this in this theory that is now stronger than ever before, that the Sylvari are related to the Druids, that I believe more than ever now that could be why they look like humans, is because the spirit that's inhabiting this tree, that by all means is no longer human, and we shouldn't think of it as a human, but because it is traced back to humanity a long way back, that could be why it's so similar. I've talked before as well, some of you might remember, about my theories of how the Pale Tree and the Sylvari could be related to another race of characters we knew about far south in Cantha, called the Wardens. And now I think that could be even stronger there too, because this other race, the Wardens, are theorized in lore to potentially have once been human but have now changed. And that just still, that ties in so perfectly with the rest of it. So I think really we're starting to form a picture. Again, that was all speculation I just said though, but very much interesting stuff about the Sylvari. And like I say, I'm not massively into the race, but they do have some great lore and some great things to theorize about. So in any case, that was kind of new. The interview has been out for a while, but as I say, if you haven't heard it or you're interested by that, if you didn't understand anything I just said because you don't even know that much about the Sylvari, again, the interview's pretty good at giving people a basic understanding. So link in the description, as I said. Anyway, moving on to servers. I've talked about that too long, typical as I always do. We're going to go with just 2 servers for today then, I suppose. The first one is a German server called Elona Reach, which I accidentally skipped the other day, so we should have done this one a little bit earlier. But this is Elona Reach, a very cool place in Guild Wars 1 that is located in the Crystal Desert. This is very much therefore tied to the story of Ascension and those failed civilizations that tried to ascend once before, and in particular the civilization that came with Churai Ossa from Elona to come and try and settle the desert. In fact, that's why it's named what it is. It's Elona Reach. This place is the furthest location that the Elonans ever reached in the desert. It's like the very maximum place that they managed to get to before they just couldn't inhabit the desert any longer. They'd been there too long. Slowly their society was dying. The buildings that they'd erected were crumbling. The Forgotten that lived there were slowly defeating them. And eventually, while that whole group of people were trying to ascend and become close to the gods, the furthest they ever got was to Elona Reach in the physical world, I suppose, because there's a difference between making progress while you're in the desert towards the means of ascension, which could be completing various tasks, and then there's also the physical means of how far into the desert did you get. Well, this was Elona Reach. It was actually quite far north in the desert. Kudos to them for that. And also, as a player of Guild Wars 1, with the exception of the Dragon's Lair and the Tomb of the Primeval Kings, which kind of existed quite separately, Elona Reach was also the furthest north we could get to. As far as I remember, I might have to quickly back myself up there. No, ignore that. We could get slightly higher north than Elona Reach, actually. There was a place nearby called Diviner's Ascent, which, by the way, is my favourite area in the desert. But anyway, Elona Reach served as both an outpost and a mission. So, as an outpost, you could read the description on the map, and it read, "This desolated outpost overlooks the skeletal remains of what might once have been a bustling seaport. Brackish puddles are all that remain of the water that once meant life to fishermen and traders alike. Today, rotted pilings and tattered sailcloth are all that mark this ghost harbour." It's a really striking place when you come here in-game, because you kind of look over and you can see what the in-game description is talking about. You can just see this massive, abandoned, like super old, wrecked shipyard, and it looks fantastic. There's these crazy big pillars with these big sails just jutting out of the landscape, and it is really quite striking. I suppose this is one of the first hints that talked about how the Crystal Desert may once have been an ocean, as we now know it was. Once Nightfall came out, it was then revealed that the Crystal Desert was once the Crystal Sea. But back where Elona Reach came out, which was a Prophecies outpost, it was only hinted at. So I suppose the ruins that we're looking at here are the ruins of the Marganites, which were the seafaring people that lived on the desert back while it was still an ocean, and Abaddon favoured them. Many Marganites then became corrupted by Abaddon and touched by his magic, and then defend him during the events of Nightfall. So you kind of think of them as being quite a negative faction, but do bear in mind that many many years ago, they were just seafaring people, and they weren't necessarily bad people, and they weren't these crazy magical corrupted people either. They were just people, and these are the ruins of them. However, laid on top of all of that as well are the remains of Chirai Os's guys. The Marganites obviously predate them for a very long time. The mission itself is one of the 3 trials you have to complete to become ascended in the game, and it requires you to run around collecting vision crystals, which you can then place on a pedestal in the middle of the entire area, and you've got to get 3 crystals as fast as you possibly can. You're on a time limit. It's an interesting mission because now, with so much power creep coming into the game, you get like a half an hour limit to complete the mission, but you can be done with it in a ridiculously short period of time. However, people who first played the game when it first came out will tell you that this was really difficult to get in the amount of time, and now you can just kind of see. It's one of those places in Guild Wars 1 where you can see how the game's aged and how the mechanics have affected certain missions. It had quite a fun bonus because there was actually quite a bit of lore around here that you could, like, things you could interact with that would teach you about these characters that once lived in the desert, these Alonans. There were 3 priests, and you can kind of click their bones and learn a lot about them. I would read it out verbatim, but I think would probably take quite a while because it is a fair bit of lore. But anyway, it's about these 3 priests and how they kind of became jealous of one another, and they wanted to protect each other's crystals, and they could never learn to work together and unite them, essentially. It's really, really cool. But that's Elona Reach. It's a nice place. The Crystal Desert, I cannot stress this enough. It's not a desert like you find in most games where people just put some sand out there and say, oh, that's it, okay, we're sorted. It is a really cool place. There is a lot of variety and history in the Crystal Desert. It's one of my favourite regions in all of Guild Wars 1, honestly, and Elona Reach was one of those places that really had a good sense of history because of just all the wrecks and stuff. Very likely that once Guild Wars 2 comes out, we'll be able to go back to Elona Reach when the Crystal Desert becomes available for play. So if that kind of thing interests you, that's a server. Alright, the second server that we'll do for today is, let's skip Nundu Bay because that's also German. We'll go to the American server, Ballis Pass. Ballis Pass is in the northern Shiver Peaks, and it's a part of the world that is full of lots of areas and lore that are just kind of confusing. There's lots of areas that have got different names, and then in the end you kind of forget that they exist completely. But the story that was going on here was, it was in the northern Shiver Peaks, so this was just after Rurik had been banished from Ascalon, and you all decide that you want to evacuate and go to Kryta. So this was the first mission on your way to Kryta. Most of the important stuff that happens on the northern Shiver Peaks occurs in the second mission. That's all the stuff where you're at the Frost Gate and where Rurik dies and you meet Dagnar Stonepate and all that stuff happens. But in the lore, Rurik actually meets with King Jarlis, the king of the Deldrimor dwarves, the dwarves that are actually allied with us, and it's during this mission that takes place. So it's a long mission that you do a lot of stuff in, but the only really significant thing in lore that happens is Rurik meeting King Jarlis. So to get there for the mission, the story actually is that there's this big storm, and I wanted to write this into the lore summary, by the way, but I never managed to. There's a lot of tiny things like this that are annoying that you can't put in. There's this big storm, it's like you cannot see at all, and there's just terrible snow going through everywhere. Rurik's pushed on ahead on his own. He's kind of been brash and he's out there again, as he nearly always was, by the way, in Guild Wars 1 before he died, which when you consider that, actually makes it so much more impactful when you realise he is alone when he dies to Dagnar. He had it coming to him. He was going out alone so often. But in this mission, Rurik's already pushed ahead because he wants to go and find Jarlis, and he wants to go and arrange some kind of safe passage through the mountains, but he's been cut off because of this storm that's swept in. So in the story, you now move out and you're trying to light these beacons that exist across the Shiver Peaks, on like this pass through the Shiver Peaks, and that's what a lot of the first part of the mission is. You're trying to light these beacons to give people visibility so that they can move through and so that you can actually find Rurik. You're mostly just fighting denizens of the Shiver Peaks and the Stone Summit while you're playing through, honestly. It's mostly Centaurs and Stone Summit. The second half of the mission, there's a lot of Stone Summit sieging an area named Croc's Hollow, and you defeat all of those Stone Summit, and then when you get inside Croc's Hollow, you find out this is actually where King Jarlis has been waiting. Rurik's been there, he's nice and safe, but they kind of got held down there because of the sieges of the Stone Summit and also because of the storm. That's why they got caught there. But you meet the king, you meet Rurik, and then the plot escalates from there. You all decide you've got to go get through the Frost Gate and you move on. So it's kind of interesting. The outpost itself is called Ballis Pass. and the description reads, the Shiver Peaks rise up over 10,000 feet above sea level. In the shadow of this enormous mountain range lie the kingdoms of Kryta to the west and Ascalon to the east. Borlis Pass is the closest travelable passage through the mountains to the city of Rin. The next closest lies much farther north, deep in Char territory. Kind of a cool description, actually. So it explains what the Shiver Peaks are to an extent, and that's because it's one of the early places you go to, so it's still teaching players what the Shiver Peaks specifically are. I like how it mentions Rin in the description, because you found that a lot in Ascalon. A lot of players still missed it, though. A lot of people didn't realise Rin was the capital. They thought just like Ascalon City, the town, was like the most important place, but it's not. It's Rin, and you constantly see in lore that they're always referencing Rin. They've got this message here about the next closest pass lies much farther north, deep in Char territory. Well, when Eye of the North came out, we actually got to go up there when we got to see what was going on around there. I suppose the developers might not have been thinking back to this one line of lore written on a single outpost description, and they might not have remembered, but you have to go really far north before you see anything even slightly like a passage through the mountains, and that would be in Norn territory. That would be through like Long Eyes Ledge, and you can actually walk through up there. So that's an interesting thought too, but that's the mission, that's the area you're in. You finish the mission by going to Grubel's Gulch, which in-game is known as the Frost Gate on the map, but that's actually Grubel's Gulch, and then from there you push out to go to the real Frost Gate, which is a different place in lore. So it's kind of funny, but yeah, if you like the Shiver Peaks, again, maybe this server will resonate with you slightly. The mission was quite cool, because I think it was one of the earlier missions that taught you about moving bundles around and lighting torches and stuff, which was quite nice. But yeah, there you go, guys. That's the Great Guild Wars 2 Countdown / Guild Wars 2 Daily for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow when we'll have just 56 days to go. Oh, by the way, a lot of people have been commenting. I do know that pre-purchase people get it a couple of days before that, but I'm just going to count down to release. We'll probably do something special when it actually comes out. I'll have to do videos in advance, because as soon as that's out, I've pre-purchased, obviously. As soon as it's out, I'm probably just going to be absorbed in the game completely. In any case, thanks very much, guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.